Very weirdly, once upon a time, I made up the terms virtual reality and mixed reality, and I had the first company. And I did a lot of other stuff. We did the first headsets commercially. Also made the first color one at all. Did a bunch of the first apps. We did the first car prototyping app. My favorite was the first surgical simulator. Later on, some friends and I had a company in the 90s called iMatic, where we pioneered the kind of stuff you see on like Snapchat, where you can add stuff to people's faces, or this ridiculous aging app that's going around. We pioneered this sort of face-related software. That sold to Google. The old VR company ended up with Oracle, weirdly. They don't seem to be doing anything with it, but I guess by now it's so long ago. Anyway, so I've been doing this a long time. What I want to talk to you about most is this sort of cultural frameworks, you might even call them mythologies, that we create to think about technology. And there are two primary ones, in my understanding, that have somewhat competed with each other. And I realize this isn't absolutely true, and it will be untrue for some people. So this is a very approximate sort of a pattern to notice. It's true for me anyway. The two mythologies or paradigms or contexts or frames or whatever you like are artificial intelligence and virtual reality. Both of which get renamed periodically. So when we speak of AI, we could be speaking of deep learning or machine learning and blah, blah, blah. There's all these variations. And similarly with virtual reality, where there's mixed reality and more recently, all the different... Actually, this whole thing about terminology goes way back. There used to be actually quite passionate wars about what things should be called in the 80s. It's funny to remember many terms you won't even have heard, probably. Now, I think these two compete in the sense that they suggest almost polar opposite approaches to the relationship between people and technology. Neither of them is really about any particular technology or any particular scientific question. For instance, the face-related software, which was the first to be able to track features and transform a face. We also won the early NIST competitions for even finding and recognizing faces. And by the way, we discovered that our face finder didn't recognize black people in the 90s. That problem is old and shouldn't be a surprise anymore. Oh my God, all these things that happened. But at any rate, that wasn't AI at that time. At that time, nobody thought of that as AI. That was part of VR. And it kind of flipped over to the other camp. And now face stuff is considered AI. Now, the idea of AI can be found going very, very far back in the literature of humanity if you care to look for antecedents. There's a wonderful thing in Plato about how someday there'll be robots to replace the annoying musicians in the agora and all this stuff. Like, it's hilarious, actually. But when we think of the AI cultural framework, most of what we think of was really formulated by just a small group of people in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. We think of Alan Turing and the Turing test, of course, but really the person who most authored the sort of cultural world that defines this was Marvin Minsky. Now, Marvin was a mentor of mine, and in fact, he was my most important mentor. And he was infinitely generous and infinitely sweet. My debt to him is indescribable. And we used to love to argue about the topic I'm presenting to you now, where I always thought from when I was a teenager in the 70s that there was something screwy about the AI narrative. And I was much more this softy humanist who believed in consciousness as this thing apart and didn't believe it's all a giant computer and blah, blah, blah. And Marvin loved to argue with me. And so whenever I talk about this stuff, I always think of Marvin. The last time I saw him, just before he passed away, one of his students called me and said, listen, Marvin's very frail. When you go there, don't engage him in some big argument. And so I showed up at the house, and he was like, oh, you're here. I really want to argue. I'm so sick of people who agree with me. And so we had this great argument. It was so wonderful. But to some degree, I hope this doesn't sound boastful, but I'm probably the principal author of the cultural framework that we call virtual reality now. And indeed, I called it virtual reality. And it was something that and I don't mean to say that I'm the only one. There are many other extremely, like just in terms of this cultural presentation of it, there are plenty of other people. But the way it was present in my mind and the way I talked about it in the 80s, which was the first wave of VR mania, was somewhat as an antipode or a reaction to artificial intelligence, an alternate framework. So I want to talk a little bit about comparing the two. I guess the first thing I want to make clear is both are based on illusions, and it's just that they're illusions presented in a different way. When a professional magician, a legitimate magician if you like, presents an illusion, they have a proscenium arch around it, and they say, here's my trick. And that's quite ethical, because if they don't outline where the trick is, they might be deceptive, they might be charlatans, they might be crooks. And so the proscenium arch has a very particular ethical role in magic, perhaps more so than in anything else that happens on a stage. To me, virtual reality is like that. Virtual reality is saying, here's the illusion, enjoy the illusion. It announces the illusion. It's ethical and honest about that. Now, in my view, AI is also an illusion. Or at least it's legitimately perceivable as an illusion. It gets a little subtle, so let me explain this. My perspective, which I used to argue with Marvin about in the old days, is that information, this thing that we can encode in bits, or qubits slightly, is alienated experience. So what that means is that when you perceive something from bits, if you don't have a cultural framework in which those bits are meaningful, then there is no meaning. It's dependent on the person who the bits are for. There are various ways to see this. It might not be immediately clear, but for instance, the thought experiment alien, a Martian or somebody comes down, and to such a Martian who's never seen written language, maybe they come from another dimension, they're not used to three-dimensional perception, maybe they're not used to two-dimensional perception, but to them, they see this thing, which is your smartphone, or for that matter, your VR headset, and to them, it's a lava lamp. It's a thing that creates heat as it makes patterns, and they might enjoy it, but they might miss everything else. So the idea of this is very much as you can store potential energy. For instance, I can lift something that is heavy, and then if I drop it, the potential energy that I stored by lifting it is released, right? And so in the same way, when I encode information into bits in a program or an example set for a machine learning algorithm, whatever it is, I am entering in information, and it's only decoded when somebody can perceive it. Now, the interesting thing about this way of looking at information is it gives people a special role. It says that it's the person who's kind of this mysterious end of the line that actually has the meaning, right? Now, a lot of people don't like that. They're like, oh, no, don't put people on a pedestal. So this is an argument I've been having with all kinds of people for many, many years, not just Marvin, lots and lots of others. Now, the thing is, this question about whether people are special or not, whether consciousness is real, whether people have some kind of special ability that is different from, or special status that's different from computers, it is complicated, and it's bound up in it has a lot of baggage. It has more baggage than anything. Oh my God. How can I start? One thing is that there are a lot of people who've spent their lives battling against people who are mired in religious superstitions that often cause them to be ridiculous. That's not to criticize all people who believe in religious ideas, but those who, believe that it's immoral to be gay, or that evolution can't be right, or vaccines must be bad, or blah, 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 blah. They're just like, and so you talk to somebody like Richard Dawkins is a great example, who's been battling religious people all their lives. And to them, to suggest anything special about people is to suggest an alliance with those who are superstitious, those who want to use beliefs in order to manipulate others. And they are often correct. That can happen. But the thing is, this business about whether people are special is a kind of a figure ground inversion opportunity. If you look at people interacting with computers, you have the freedom to perceive that as a meeting of equals or as a meeting of those who are different, those who have the special thing and machines that don't. This business of where you draw the line isn't science. It's an example of something that's really pure philosophy or pure belief. From a strict truth test point of view, all of the places you can draw the line are equally valid. I used to propose a way of thinking about this, which is called the circle of empathy. And here's how it works. You draw a circle around yourself, and you say, those things within the circle deserve empathy, and those things that are outside of the circle do not. So, for instance, perhaps rocks are outside of the circle. Perhaps. There might be rocketarians or something who would disagree and hold rocks sacred, and it might be only certain rocks. Maybe there's certain sacred rocks, but maybe other rocks aren't. Sometimes the circle is hard to place. There are plenty of people who would not include all humans within the circle. Racists do not include all humans within the circle. Homophobes and xenophobes do not include all humans inside the circle, and so on. People come to blows over where the circle should be. There are those who wish to place the fetus in the circle. There are those who wish to place animals in the circle, and others who do not. And then this debate about AI kind of amounts to whether computers go inside the circle or not, or at least some hypothetical computer. Now, the thing about the circle is it's ultimately a moral choice. It's not scientifically a real thing. There's no circle position meter. There's no meter that measures consciousness. As Turing pointed out at the dawn of all this in the Turing test, there's no absolute test for something like humanness or consciousness or any of these things. It's subjective. It's all up to people perceiving one way or another. And so the Turing test is based on a judge, not on, and these days when people are trying to judge whether their deep learning algorithm is good or not, they compare it to people performing the same task. It's all based on comparisons, not any kind of absolute standard. You could say that about anything in science, except it's not the same, because other things in science are based on, ultimately, on universal constants. This is not. This is cultural. Now, the advantages of making your circle as big as possible is you're less likely to be an asshole by mistake. The advantage of making your circle smaller is you're more likely to avoid certain kinds of incompetence. So for instance, if you decided to make your circle large to include bacteria, and you say, I hold bacteria sacred, I will no longer brush my teeth, you end up at a point where you're not helping anybody, not even bacteria. And so there's a way that making the circle too large creates incompetence, or the other thing is it can create manipulation. For instance, if you pretend to speak for something that can't speak for itself, you might actually be overriding people who can speak for themselves, which is what happens when the advocate for the fetus overrides the woman who's pregnant. And so you can actually become abusive without even realizing it. So this business is it's a kind of a competency morality puzzle. And I have sympathy for those who have difficulty figuring out where to place the circle. And I don't believe that any of us have our circles precisely correct. I don't even think that's possible. But I think we can get pretty good at placing our circle. Now, in the case of the AI idea, the circle is expanded to include computers. But I think it's important to remember how this notion first came about. And instead of talking about Plato and his suspicion of musicians or many other writers before Turing, let's talk about Turing as one starting point. When I was taught computer science, we were always told that this, one of our founders, our principal founder, Alan Turing, had come up with this thought experiment, and it was foundational, very much like Einstein's thought experiments about bullets and elevators and all of that were foundational to relativity. And we were never told anything at all about Turing's life, which is now better known. There's been a movie and whatnot. But I was absolutely gobsmacked, as they say, when I discovered the circumstances under which Turing came up with the Turing test. It was very close to the end of his life. It was in the final weeks. Turing's story, for those of you who don't know, was that he was obviously one of the very first computer scientists. He and von Neumann defined the abstract model we use for classical computation. He was one of the first programmers. He was one of the first people to apply computers to anything. And he's most celebrated for using an early computer to break a Nazi secret code that had been considered unbreakable. And giving Britain access to secret Nazi communications is thought by many to have saved Britain from an invasion. It was obviously bombed, but it wasn't invaded. That was better. After the war, he was celebrated as one of the great heroes of World War II. But there was one problem, which is that he was gay at a time when it was illegal to be gay in Britain. And so he was forced to endure a bizarre treatment that was supposed to, was like their version of conversion therapy. It was supposed to cure him of his homosexuality, but they used chemicals. Now, for us, from our present day perspective, it's almost impossible to put ourselves in the mindset to understand what these people were thinking, because it's just so macabre and weird. But remember, in those days, the computer was not yet the model for the mind. This was before there was this idea that computers and minds are similar. So the thing that was the model for the mind was the steam engine. That was the metaphor. And steam engines are all about pressure building up and releasing pressure if there's too much pressure, and it's all this pressure stuff. And you can see that metaphor at work in Freud's work, for instance. It's all about too much libido and things building and all that. And so the idea was that if you're gay, it must be that you're oversexed. So the way to correct it is to inject you or force you to receive female hormones to balance you. And so Turing, against his will, was forced to receive these, and he started to develop the physical characteristics of a female body, which he did not want. He became terribly depressed, and so far as we can tell, he committed suicide by eating an apple laced with cyanide by his computer. So the first computer was part of a suicide ritual for its inventor. And so what's going on here? The Turing test is something that he conceived of in the last weeks when he was undoubtedly starting to plan his suicide, because it was a suicide that took planning. He proposed a thought experiment in which an old Victorian parlor game in which a man and a woman each are shrouded behind screens and can send little messages, similar to today's tweets, I suppose, to a judge. And they're both trying to fool the judge, potentially, and the judge is supposed to tell which is the man and which is the woman. And Turing said, let's get rid of the woman. Get that woman out of there. We'll put a computer in her place. And now you have a computer and a man, each passing notes to a judge, and the judge is asked to choose. And what Turing says is, if the judge cannot distinguish the two, shouldn't the computer be given some sort of recognition, some sort of status, some sort of rights, some sort of empathy, something? Now, outside of the context, you might look at this and you think, well, this is a nerd argument for computer-human equivalence or something, a challenge of the bar you'd have to meet to declare computers as not being the same as people. And of course, we can always claim the Turing test has been beat. It has been in a multitude of little ways, so we can get rid of that distinction. But I think in context, you see something totally different. In context, you see a moral challenge to the society that was killing him. I think what he's saying is, I have devoted my life to fighting the Nazis. The very definition of a Nazi is someone who kills others because of their identity, and now you're doing it to me. And I think perhaps he imagined a more pristine existence in the computer that didn't have all these issues of identity. Maybe he imagined a future in which other people are also judged not to be fully human. But you know what, when you read him, it's funny. I've never found even the slightest touch of anger or revenge or resentment in Turing. It's almost incredible. Like he was gentle. And he has an amazing line in a footnote to the first statement of the Turing test where he says that, you know what, even if we consider computers to be like people, they'll still ultimately have been made by God, and it shouldn't change any of our ideas about spirituality, which is a remarkable thing to say right at the start, isn't it? Because people who are facing death naturally wonder about souls, they naturally wonder about survival, and that makes this whole thing even more mucked up. And the problem with the AI mythology is that it has started to become abusive of people's fears in the same way that medieval religions were, or unfortunately many contemporary ones, where a person is afraid of dying, and then the high priest says, oh, I know how to get your consciousness to survive. I can back you up to the cloud. And the person says, okay, I will fund you. And of course, this is all, once again, a magician who hasn't acknowledged the proscenium arch. They don't know, none of us know. Now, meanwhile, the AI, the virtual reality idea was conceived to demonstrate through example that there's another way to think about computation, something different. And I want to try to give you a little bit of a sense of why I believe, and I want to emphasize, what's VR and what isn't VR is not absolute. I mean, all kinds of things are called VR that don't seem so to me, and whatever, and it's a way of thinking more than any, there's no precise delineation of which hardware, which software is VR or isn't, or is a mixed reality or whatever. I mean, by the way, this thing lists me as Microsoft. When I speak, I don't speak for Microsoft, believe me. I say things that horrify them all the time, so that should be under there. But if I was having my Microsoft hat on, I'd point out we sell these things called mixed reality headsets that are actually classical occlusive headsets. You might ask why. None of us know. We don't know why we do that. But anyway, this is just to say that these definitions are not absolute. So, when you interact with a computer that's been designed by somebody who believes in AI, the computer will pretend to be a person. There'll be a thing, how can I help you? It'll pretend to be a Siri or Cortana or whatever. And then this happens enough and you start to think you're kind of just one little cog in the giant cloud brain, one little cell. It starts to hypnotize you into believing it. And indeed, the way the computer interacts with you is the way you interact with it, and it creates the illusion for a moment that this whole thing is just information exchange. In a sense, it doesn't matter if you have internal experience, you can still use your smartphone. It still kind of would be sensible, I suppose. It's a funny thing about internal experience or consciousness or interiority or awareness or just the existence of experience, whatever term you propose. We can experience it ourselves, but as far as others, we only know their consciousness by faith, right? You have faith that your lover or perhaps your dog or your child is actually conscious in there. I once wrote a comic paper in the 90s in an academic journal suggesting that the only people for whom one could tell if they were truly conscious or not were professional philosophers, where their philosophy would reflect whether they experienced consciousness. And the sort of Daniel Dennett, hard AI kind of philosophers were just dead inside. They just didn't have it. To which, I used to have fun. I used to do public events with people like Richard Dawkins and Daniel Dennett and Marvin, for that matter. And Dennett would say, "Oh yes, absolutely. I have no consciousness inside. That's correct." And I'd say, "Great. You know, this actually works. It actually is this total consistency. We agree. We're happy. I'm conscious. You're not. Great. Let's eat." VR is a different sort of thing, though. So let's say you put on a classical occlusive headset and you're in a virtual world, and obviously the whole point is that the world can change. So maybe you're in some weird world of butterflies on an alien planet or whatever, you know, all the sorts of things one does. And as you undoubtedly also know, you can change your body's map. You can turn into some different creature and still control it and feel like you embody it. So maybe you turn into a weird scorpion jellyfish thing. So there's much more variable than there would be in normal everyday life, which is of course the point. So you varied all these things. Once you start learning a bit more of the science and the craft, you realize that you can change the perception of the flow of time. You can change the way people perceive colors. You can change the way they hear. You can change the way people communicate with each other. You can create merged avatars where the sense of body connection becomes different than it would ever be in the physical world. You can just do all these things, and I'm sure there are many more tricks that are yet to be discovered. But the question is, as all these things are variable, there's still something that doesn't change, which is you're floating in there. There's somebody perceiving all this. And that is a remarkable thing, which is easy to miss. As virtual world experiences change, you remain there floating. That's you. That's your consciousness. You never notice it otherwise, because usually it's just continuous with everything. Usually your consciousness is just part of the flow of physicality. But in virtual reality, because the exterior world is variable, that you are still there even when everything changes. There you are. That is you floating there. That's an angel or something. Now, this observation is not a scientific observation. You can formulate arguments against it. You can say it's an illusion. But as I used to say, consciousness is the only thing that isn't reduced if it's an illusion. That's one definition of it. Do you see that? So there you are, floating. And VR is the only technology that highlights that. It's the only consciousness illuminating digital thing. Now, I think there are other things that folk that also do. I mean, I think musical instruments do it and whatnot. But, you know, to do a digital thing that does that, I think it's VR. That would be one of my definitions of VR anyway. I have a lot of them, I suppose. So, the thing about artificial intelligence is that it's an arbitrary way of parsing the world, and so is virtual reality, but I'd propose that they're opposites. I'm not suggesting they're the only two options, perhaps, but they're the two that we know about to any degree of detail and experience and culture for technology. Virtual reality can be thought of as a spatial illusion in the sense that your body can change, the world can change, your proximity to other people can change. They're all things that have a little bit to do with space. Whether it's visual or haptic or audio or whatever, it's still things changing in space. or space-time, I suppose, if you like. AI, to me, is an illusion that takes place in time, because what happens is you gather all this data from people, mash it up, and then present it as if it's a live person at that time, but it's really a crowd of people from before. So AI is a time illusion, VR is a space illusion, primarily. It's a rough, once again, one can argue, especially around the edges of that one. But where the distinction really becomes important to me is economically. One of the problems with AI is because of the arbitrariness and the ambiguity of recognizing when something is an AI. It's very easy for AI to become abusive. Now, it might be with virtual reality too. Perhaps somebody can use virtual worlds to train people to become horrible or something. I'm worried that might happen. But so far, the great abuser has been AI. And what will happen is somebody will call an algorithm AI when what it's really doing is it's manipulating people. It's really allowing the people who own the computer to screw with the other people. This has a great history, which I wish was better known. The very first person to propose and design what a network experience would be like was named Ted Nelson, who's still with us and lives in Sausalito. And he was imagining this super creative, artistic thing that would be very democratic and respectful. The first person to actually implement a network experience was a behaviorist named B.F. Skinner. Have you all heard of B.F. Skinner? So in the early 60s, Skinner was this person who would methodically train animals and people in what was called a Skinner box in his publicity, where you'd control when you got reward and punishment in order to change behavior patterns. And this was his thing. And he's one of the people who documented how teasing people, how making reward and punishment a little random and a little unpredictable actually makes the mind lock onto it more and is even more powerful. So he's one of the pioneers. But one of the things he believed is that eventually there could be a digital network that would addict everybody and put them under behavior modification, and then that would create the perfect orderly society, because he didn't like all these disorderly hippie people. He would have hated Turing. He was really into creating a conformist society. And so he actually started implementing these things with one of the pre-internet networks in the early 60s. This was all way before ARPANET. This was before there was packet switching, if you know what that is. There's this problem that because AI can be anything, and because AI doesn't usually really work reliably, there's always that little glitch at the end of it. It's never quite right, so it's not ever quite there. So what it really turns into is a way to dress up behavior modification, which is what's happened with our good friends at Google and Facebook. And I love them. I mean, like I was mentioning, the Face software company was sold to Google. They're all friends of mine and stuff, but I just think the business plan is so horrible. But that's a whole other story. But what we call AI has become almost exclusively about giant businesses tricking people. It's become, not exclusively, but almost exclusively. There's also once in a while some algorithm that's good at playing a game or something like that, and those things get a lot of publicity. But in the field, it's all about tricking people. So the thing is, if your starting mentality is that people and machines are the same, you program machines, why not program people? Then it all seems perfectly normal and natural, and why not? And yet there's something terribly wrong about it. It seems to me that you've fallen into a trap that's rather similar to the person who says, who cares about the woman? I'm going to protect the fetus. And what you're actually doing is saying, I want to control women. You know, that's the actual effect. And we're sort of saying, you know, there's this way that you start controlling people through computation, which I think is such a horrendous idea that I don't think we can ever find sanity again until we cease it. So this is a whole other talk I give about the future of internet economics. But what I want to propose here is that the most crucial thing about virtual reality isn't just that it can be beautiful. It isn't just that it's a window into our cognition. It helps us understand ourselves. It isn't just that it's fun. that it can be radical. None of that is as important as the idea that you can't do it unless you believe people are real. Because otherwise, what's this whole thing for? You know, there's an intrinsic message in the VR system that the person inside the headset is the recipient of all this, the reason for it. That is not true when you're connected to a big cloud on your smartphone. Then the center is the cloud. It's part of this giant, you're becoming part of this giant global brain, something or other, that hypothetically is supposed to turn into the singularity or something. You're part of this other thing. But there's no reason to center all these gadgets around a person unless you believe in people. Do you see the difference? All right. So I would argue that that moral centering of the devices and the software around the person instead of the big computer is the crucial definition of virtual reality. And anything that does that, that wants to call itself virtual reality or some similar term, fine by me. Then I think it's totally earned that designation. Now, one of the difficulties we've had in virtual reality is, oh boy, so I want to talk about some things that might potentially offend some people in this room, and I apologize if that's the case. I don't know you, and maybe I have it wrong. But there was, as we all know, this fresh boom of interest in virtual reality 5 or 6 years ago now, when there was suddenly a lot more investment in it, and a zillion startups and all these things. And the problem with it is that it was overlapped very strongly with the gaming world, and the gaming world was going through the Gamergate-style convulsions. So unfortunately, the particular timing and nature of the most recent VR revival brought with it this ugly energy that I was repulsed by, which is kind of why I sat it out. I wasn't really around during the boom with Oculus and all that stuff, because the culture was ugly. And that's not to say that the VR culture was always ugly, but it was always, it's kind of like gaming in itself isn't ugly, but gaming culture can be really ugly. The game itself might be fine, but then the boards associated with the game might be horrible. In that sense, VR was kind of turning horrible. And there were a lot of huge egos. There were a lot of people who were acting out of weird fears of other people that made no sense, and just all this garbage. And I feel like it's cleaned out a bit at this point. It's a little bit like blockchain, like all the people who wanted a quick buck have finally gotten bored and they're sort of gone. And the people who are left, I think, are like better. So I'm kind of wanting to get more involved with it again. Yeah, so that's my short take on it. So the problem, though, is that because this huge period of investment where many billions of dollars flowed into virtual reality rather suddenly was so focused on a certain mentality, and that mentality was kind of stupid. I mean, it was sort of like, well, I'm going to go into a game and I'm going to be like God and everybody else sucks and all those people are stupid, but I can program better. But it's like this whole stupid thing. I hate it. And you know what I'm talking about. Once again, maybe I'm being unfair, but I don't think so. I mean, the obvious thing about it was the misogyny, but that wasn't the whole of the problem. There was just, even leaving aside the misogyny, the nature of what was left had a shallow quality. And so, unfortunately, we still have a legacy that was shaped by where those investments went. So the investments went more into hardware than software in that period. And thus, we have great headsets and barely passable development environments, which is just weird. So, and I run into the danger sometimes of being like the elder who says, oh, things made more sense in my day and you kids don't get it. And maybe that's true. Like, I mean, I might be falling into a fallacy like that. But in the old days, which for me was late 70s into the 80s, it was considered obvious and necessary that the most important thing is the development experience, because this was an expressive medium. By the way, just to let you know, the timer screen just went out, so at this point, I might speak forever. For those who are running the house. So It was considered, and now it says no signal. That's good. Uh, it's probably Microsoft software too, right? All right, so it was considered obvious that the whole point was for it to be a communications medium. Do you know the name of the first commercial headset that was sold? You might not. It was called an iPhone, but it was EYE phone. That was the first commercial headset that was ever sold. And they were actually pretty good. They were too heavy, but the optics were actually excellent, and the screens were better than you'd think. And they were okay. But it was called an iPhone because the whole idea was that this is a phone. This is not like a solitary thing. In fact, the term virtual reality, I should explain where that came from. The person who invented the tracking headset, where you move your head around and the world seems to stay still, was Ivan Sutherland, who's also essentially the founder and inventor of computer graphics, and is also still with us. He's living in Oregon now. And Ivan used the term virtual world to describe what was out there, and in a virtual, what you'd see through the headset. And he did that in a paper when I was 3 years old, so it was before I was around. But he got virtual world from an art theorist from the 40s and 50s named Suzanne Langer. So the term virtual world was actually coined way before the technology worked. And, oh yeah, it is Microsoft. And then, oh God. Oh, maybe not. That might be Apple, actually. I'm not sure. No, it's Microsoft. Okay, so, no, it's Apple. It's an Apple thing that looks like a Microsoft thing. What is going on in the world? Anyway, okay, so, Suzanne Langer was a really fascinating art theorist who was thinking about many of these same ideas, but not in a digital context, obviously, because it was too early. And so when I came along, my thought is, what we really should be talking about is how people can communicate through these things. How do they connect? And so the social version of a virtual world would be a virtual reality. So that's where it came from. And so it was obvious that if the point was for people to communicate, if the point was to connect, if the point was to explore, if the point was to create creative variations in the world so that you would notice that your consciousness, your center of experience, was still floating there no matter what changed, if that was the whole point, then the experience of creating was more important than the experience of what had been created. And therefore, not just us, but everybody who was involved in early VR tried to create worlds where you would invent while you were inside, where you could program while you were inside, where you could model while you were inside. And today, we have this totally different paradigm where you can do like a little bit of object placement, but it's kind of weird, and you have to kind of know how to program, and you have to cobble these things together. And there's hardly anything you can use to really make serious stuff while you're on the inside. And that's just strange. It's just weird. It would be, I don't even know how to describe how strange this is. It would be like designing a car, but it wasn't roadworthy, and you could only use it in this little closed circuit, and you'd have to hire these people to change the closed circuit all the time. I mean, it's a very weird thing to me, and it still strikes me as weird. And but the thing is that there's such the gaming culture is one in which there's all this investment in a gaming studio and they put a ton of money into making whatever it is, a Halo or something, which is to name a Microsoft one, and then you present it to people. And that's a different thing. The gaming world is not, it just kind of glommed onto virtual reality as this idea at a certain point. And the thing about virtual reality is it does have this kind of sexiness in the way that AI does. It does have this forward feeling like this is really a paradigm changer thing. I should say that in both AI and in VR, the supposedly radical new ideas have been the same for 30 or 40 years. You know, I mean, it just keeps on, you keep on repeating the same things, but they always sound new. And so this evergreen feeling that there's this radical new thing. is a way to raise money. In fact, in the old days when I used to argue with Marvin and I used to say, oh, but I mean, you do know that this AI thing is bullshit, right? And he'd say, well, you can look at it either way, but it's going to be so great for getting funding, so just shut up and go along with it. And then we'd go to DARPA and get funded, you know? And so I get that. I understand that. It's true for both AI and for VR. But the heart of VR has to be creating within it in a way that other people, like, so this is an idea that in the early days I called post-symbolic communication. And so what that means is that most of the forms of communication we're used to are mediated by some system in which we're used to things referring to other things. Like, for instance, words refer to certain things, or notes on a page refer to what you might do with an instrument, and so on. And this gets back to, remember I was talking about how information is alienated experience? The information is the encoding of experience, right? So we can call that symbolic if we like. So post-symbolic communication would be something that would combine the fluidity of symbols with the experience of the concrete world. It would be a concrete kind of fluidity. So I used to have a lot of ways of talking about this, and I wish I could channel one of my talks from the 80s, because I used to be very prophet-like and sort of intense, and I don't think I can quite do that now, especially after all that's happened with the internet practically destroying our world. So I have a much more measured feeling about it now, but the way I would talk about it is, there's a bunch of ways, but here's one. There's one about young childhood. So when you're a little baby, you don't understand the difference between imagination and reality yet. Or so I surmise. I don't really remember it, so I'm not sure, but I think that's true. And then there comes, so the thing is, if you're not quite sure what's real and what's not, it's as if you're a god all the time. Like, I guess what the gaming weenies aspire to or something. And you know, like you might imagine some crazy creature, and it's as if it's real. Sometimes imaginary friends or creatures are very real to children. And then there comes this moment, and I think this often has something to do with the terrible twos and the difficulty of toddlerhood, where you start to get clear, oh, actually, I'm not the Lord of the universe. I'm this helpless little wet pink thing that wets itself and is absolutely dependent. Humans have this particularly humiliating childhood because of neoteny, where we're more helpless than almost any other species for a long time. So it's this incredible demotion. It's the great, you're from God to this helpless thing that wets itself. It's like this gigantic fall on a cliff, right? And it's hard to deal with that. And then a little later you learn about mortality, and then it's like things really suck. And like, I thought I was God of the universe. This is really hard. And so the thing is that gradually you start learning that there's some tiny parts of this world that you're embedded in, this physical world, where you do have the freedom to create about as quickly as you do in your imagination. And there are little parts of your body that you can move quickly and with facility, your fingers, but mostly your tongue and your mouth, actually, to your body to a degree. And that becomes your definition of who you are physically. It's the part you can control as fast as you think, as fast as you feel. And then you learn you can manipulate these things in order to refer to all the stuff you can't actually do. So I can't actually build a sudden mile-wide, bespectacled octopus flying above San Francisco with its tentacles stirring the fog. But I can say those words as quickly as I thought of them. You know, and so what it is it extends the little part of the world you actually can control as fast as you think and feel, which is mostly, you know, your mouth and your fingers, but more generally your body, in order to refer to all the things that you cannot. Now the thing is, so the channel by which people can understand you as fast as you think and feel is most often mediated by this kind of symbol layer, like words. But, and not always, like with music, the music I'm playing here, it isn't, except this is only form, there's no content to it. I don't know how to, if I was conveying something about a giant octopus with this, it would be through a symbolic layer in it. So, with virtual reality, potentially, if people could improvise within virtual reality, if you had a good enough interface that you could start to make things as you think of them, I don't know how to build that interface, but I do have some thoughts. But if you could start to express yourself by making things in it, then people would perceive something like you're dreaming, but without the symbolic layer. They'd actually perceive the stuff directly, right? So the idea is that virtual reality has the objectivity of the world, the fluidity of dreaming. And so I would think of it as being like an extension of early childhood into adulthood that isn't presently possible. There are many other ways to think about it, but this to me is a truer North Star for the future of virtual reality than the people who are saying, oh, we're going to make the illusion better and better, because who cares? I mean, this is an agenda that just mystifies me. I absolutely understand if somebody says, I want to make a virtual reality interface where surgeons can train better, or where musicians can perform better, or whatever. If there's some human thing you want to achieve with it, and you need to make it better, and you need better sensors and a better software control loop and this and that, that's a sensible agenda. Just creating the illusion is stupid, because perception is so imperfect anyway. Like, what the hell are you doing? It's a very weird agenda for me. And in fact, one of the great illusions that technologists perform to their own detriment is to pretend that they're not changing people. So for instance, it's amazing to me, I talk to my friends at Facebook all the time, and they still believe, after all that's happened, that they're only measuring, that they're not creating, that there's nothing iatrogenic going on, that if you use all of these techniques to get people's attention and to steer them around, you're only measuring their hard desires that they had from some other place. You're not actually programming them, which is really stupid. I mean, it's like laughable. In the same way, trying to make this super realistic VR will just change the way people perceive. Because it's such an abstract goal, it's not to any purpose. So it doesn't have a grounding. It's a loop that's taken off on its own. It might seem like it does, but it actually doesn't, because people are evolving all the time. People are changing. And this also becomes a problem with AI in the sense that both VR and AI have this problem. If those who do research in these areas believe that people are unchanging, and there's some fixed bar where you pass the Turing test and you make the perfect VR that feels real or something like that, it's presuming an untruth, which is that people don't change. One of the things that I believe about VR is that as it gets better, it teaches us to perceive the difference between virtual reality and reality better and better. So in the old days, once again, as the old days, long ago, before you were born, before the era of computer-generated racist horribleness, and before all of that, we had the first demos of shared virtual worlds, of virtual reality. We had the first ones in color. We had the first ones with your hand in them. Like, there was a whole bunch of stuff about our stuff that just wasn't available. In fact, we had the first ones that weren't wireframes. And so it was a very much sought after demo. And actually, one of the things about those years that I don't miss is how the politics and the sort of heavy-handedness that people used to try to get in the demo queue, which was very uncomfortable. But at any rate, whenever we did do a demo for someone who'd never experienced it before, I'd always try to sneak something into the room in front of the person that was an interesting physical object, usually a flower. I think we had a geode sitting around or something like that. And the reason why is there's this amazing moment that these days I think is just kind of wasted because people aren't thinking about it this way. But there's this moment where you've gotten used to whatever the quality is of the VR system of the moment, whatever its tracking is and its resolution and it's the way it represents your hands and all of that kind of stuff and how much freedom of motion you have and blah, blah, blah. All of that becomes your normal after a little while when you're in the demo. You take the headset off and then you look at something from the real world and it's hyper real for a moment. Like what you can do is you can treat virtual reality not as an alternative to reality at all, because it's not, it's a medium. It's a thing we make, it's an artifact, it's a performance, it's a magic act. but you can treat it as a palate freshener. You can treat it as a way to perceive the usual world with greater alacrity. And that, to me, remains the most beautiful moment in all of virtual reality, is that moment when you take the thing off. In the case of mixed reality, where you're still seeing the real world, the analogous way to do that is, well, okay, so I had one of my student interns. Which one did this? Judith Amoris from MIT Media Lab did this. She did this weird vandalism program with a HoloLens. And so what you do with it is you mess up a space. You can graffiti the walls, and you can throw this gloop stuff, and the gloop covers things. And you can, what else was there? I think maybe you can spray like foam and spiderweb. I don't think she had toilet paper in it, but anyway, it's just like you can basically be and you can be a vandal, and it's really fun. It's actually kind of cool. But the thing about it, though, is, and this might sound like sacrilege, this might sound like the most horrible thing in the world to do, but it's an amazing experience to go into the redwood forest with that program and a HoloLens, and harmlessly start adding artifacts to the trees, and then suddenly you see the difference, and you really see the tree. That's the thing that is so amazing. Now you should say, why do you need some fancy expensive headset to see a tree? Maybe it's pathetic that one might need it, but whatever works, you know? And I just find it astonishing. Like, it opens my perception. And for all of the applications of VR that I've been involved with, and there have been a lot over the years, well, I won't say that that's my very favorite. My very favorite is the surgical simulator, which I'll say something about in a second. But my second favorite is this palate freshener thing. Like, just being able to see reality by comparing it to something is the heart and soul of VR from my point of view. So in the 80s, Ann Lasko and I and a surgeon at Stanford named Joe Rosen built the first surgical simulator in VR. And it's evolved and evolved and gone through many generations. A few years ago, my wife had cancer, which she has recovered from, and she's doing great. And her principal surgeon used a procedure that was designed in a direct descendant of original VR simulator. He trained for it, and it turned out his teacher had been a student of Joe's, the original collaborator. So these things come around. And that's my very, very favorite VR application story.